The helicopter blades chopped through the thick desert air as Lieutenant Sarah Chen pressed her back against the metal wall of the aircraft. Around her, 12 Navy SEALs sat in complete silence, their faces painted with black and green camouflage, weapons secured between their knees. The mission briefing had been clear. Extract a captured intelligence officer from a Taliban compound in Afghanistan's Helmand province. What they didn't know was that their medic carried secrets that would soon change how every single one of them viewed combat. Sarah had been assigned to SEAL Team 7 just 3 months ago. At 26 years old, she was one of the youngest field medics ever to work directly with Special Operations Forces. Her small frame and quiet demeanor often made the hardened warriors forget she was even there. They called her Doc, like they did all medics. But there was something different about the way she moved, the way her eyes constantly scanned for threats, and how she never seemed rattled by anything. The team leader, Commander Jake Morrison, had initially questioned having a female medic on such dangerous missions, not because he doubted her medical skills, but because he worried about the additional complications it might create in hostile territory. Sarah had proven herself capable during training exercises, but real combat was different. Real combat changed people. As the helicopter descended toward the landing zone, Petty Officer Mike Torres glanced at Sarah. She was checking her medical kit for the 3rd time. Her movements precise and methodical. Her hands never shook, even though this was supposed to be her first combat deployment with the team. Most new medics showed some sign of nervousness before their first real mission. Sarah showed none. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and sand. The SEALs moved out quickly, establishing a perimeter, while Sarah grabbed her medical bag and followed. The compound was 2 kilometers away through rocky terrain that provided perfect cover for enemy fighters. Intelligence suggested at least 15 Taliban fighters were holding the captured officer in a fortified building. Commander Morrison led the team through a series of hand signals, directing them toward their objective. Sarah kept pace easily, her breathing steady, despite the heavy equipment she carried. The medical bag alone weighed 40 pounds, filled with everything needed to treat severe battlefield injuries. She also carried her personal weapon, a modified M4 carbine, though she hoped she wouldn't need to use it. Halfway to the target, the point man held up his fist, signaling the team to stop. Through his night vision goggles, he had spotted 2 sentries, positioned on a ridge overlooking their route. The team would need to eliminate them silently to avoid alerting the compound. Commander Morrison looked back at his men, then made the decision to send 2 SEALs around the flank while the rest waited. Sarah crouched behind a large boulder, watching the darkness ahead. This was the part of missions she had always found most difficult: the waiting. During her previous deployments, she had learned that the mind could be your worst enemy during these quiet moments. Memories had a way of surfacing when you least wanted them to. The suppressed gunshots came almost simultaneously, barely audible over the desert wind. 2 quick flashes in the darkness. Then, silence. The point man's voice crackled through their radio earpieces. Sentries down. Route is clear. They moved forward again, covering the remaining distance to the compound in 20 minutes. The building was larger than expected, a 2-story structure with high walls surrounding a courtyard. Multiple entry points offered tactical advantages, but also increased the risk of the mission going wrong if they encountered more resistance than anticipated. Commander Morrison positioned his team around the building's perimeter. Sarah found herself assigned to the rear entry point with 3 other SEALs. Her job was to stay back and provide medical support if anyone was wounded during the assault. But she also knew that in special operations, plans rarely survived first contact with the enemy. The breach came at exactly 0200 hours. Explosive charges blew open the front door, while teams entered through windows on both sides of the building. Sarah heard the distinctive pop of flashbang grenades, followed by shouting in both English and Pashto. Automatic weapons fire erupted from inside the compound. "Contact front, multiple hostiles." The radio chattered with position reports and target updates. Sarah listened carefully, tracking the movement of each team member through the building. So far, no one had called for medical assistance. Then everything changed. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded against the wall just 30 feet from Sarah's position. The blast threw her backward, and she felt sharp pain as shrapnel peppered her left arm and shoulder. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard screaming. "Medic! We need a medic now!" Sarah shook her head to clear it and grabbed her medical bag. Blood was running down her arm, but she ignored it. 2 SEALs were down in the courtyard, one with a severe leg wound and another who wasn't moving at all. She sprinted toward them as bullets cracked overhead. The wounded SEAL, Petty Officer David Kim, had taken shrapnel in his thigh. Blood was pumping out rhythmically, indicating arterial damage. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him and immediately applied pressure to the wound while reaching for her medical supplies with her other hand. "Stay with me, Kim," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the chaos around them. "You're going to be fine." But even as she worked on Kim's leg, she could see the other SEAL wasn't breathing. Petty Officer Ryan Walsh had been caught in the full blast of the RPG. Sarah knew immediately that there was nothing she could do for him. More gunfire erupted from the building as the remaining SEALs continued their assault. Sarah focused entirely on keeping Kim alive, working to stop the bleeding while enemy bullets sparked off the concrete around them. Her training took over completely, blocking out fear and pain from her own wounds. "I've got the bleeder controlled," she radioed to Commander Morrison. "But I need immediate evacuation for Kim. He's lost a lot of blood." The response came back immediately. "Negative on evacuation. LZ is too hot. Taliban reinforcements are moving in from the north. You need to stabilize him for transport." Sarah looked down at Kim, who was pale and going into shock. Getting him to the helicopter would require carrying him over rough terrain while potentially under fire. She made quick calculations about blood loss, fluid replacement, and pain management. Everything would have to be perfect. That's when the second RPG hit. The second rocket-propelled grenade struck the corner of the building, sending chunks of concrete flying in all directions. Sarah threw herself over Kim to shield him from the debris, feeling pieces of stone and metal rain down on her back. When the dust settled, she could hear new voices shouting in the darkness. Taliban reinforcements had arrived. Commander Morrison's voice came through the radio with urgency she had never heard before. "All teams, we've got company coming in from multiple directions. Estimate 20 to 30 hostiles approaching from the north and east. We need to move now." Sarah looked down at Kim, who was barely conscious. The makeshift pressure bandage she had applied was holding, but he needed immediate surgery if he was going to survive. Moving him now could restart the bleeding, but staying meant certain death for all of them. "Morrison, Kim can't be moved yet," she radioed back. "I need 5 more minutes to get him stabilized." "Doc, we don't have 5 minutes. Taliban trucks are less than 2 clicks out." Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She grabbed a morphine injector from her kit and gave Kim a dose that would keep him unconscious during transport. Then she began packing the wound with hemostatic gauze, working faster than she had ever worked before. Automatic weapons fire erupted from the north side of the compound. The Taliban reinforcements had made contact with the SEAL perimeter team. Through the chaos, Sarah could hear individual voices calling out targets and ammunition counts. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. "Taurus, Henderson, fall back to the rally point." Commander Morrison was pulling his teams back toward the extraction zone. "Doc, you need to move Kim now." Sarah looked around for help, but the other SEALs were engaged in fierce firefights on multiple fronts. She would have to move Kim by herself. At 110 pounds, she weighed less than the wounded SEAL, but she had been trained for this exact situation. She positioned Kim in a fireman's carry across her shoulders, grabbed her medical bag, and started moving toward the extraction point. Each step sent jolts of pain through her own wounded arm, but she forced herself to keep going. The weight was crushing, and the uneven terrain made every step treacherous in the darkness. Bullets cracked past her head as Taliban fighters spotted her movement. Sarah zigzagged between rocks and small buildings, using every piece of cover available. Kim's blood was soaking through her uniform, but she could feel his chest rising and falling against her back. He was still alive. The extraction point was a flat area behind a small hill, about 800 meters from the compound. Sarah had covered half the distance when she heard the distinctive whine of an incoming mortar round. She threw herself and Kim behind a large boulder, just as the explosion erupted 30 meters away, showering them with dirt and rocks. Her radio crackled with bad news. "Doc, we've got 3 more wounded at the rally point. Rodriguez took one in the chest, and Williams has a head injury. How far out are you?" Sarah looked at the remaining distance to the extraction point, then down at Kim, who was beginning to regain consciousness from the morphine wearing off. She had medical supplies for multiple casualties, but treating 3 seriously wounded men while under fire would be almost impossible. 200 meters out, she responded. "What's the status on the helicopter?" "Still inbound, but the pilot reports heavy ground fire around the LZ. He might not be able to land." "Ace." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, calculating their options. Without helicopter evacuation, the wounded SEALs would die, but the Taliban forces were closing in from multiple directions, and soon they would be completely surrounded. She started moving again, pushing through the pain and exhaustion. Kim was becoming more alert, which was good for his survival, but made carrying him more difficult. He tried to speak several times, but Sarah told him to save his energy. When she finally reached the rally point, the scene was worse than she had imagined. Rodriguez was lying on his back with a sucking chest wound, fighting for every breath. Williams was conscious, but had a deep laceration across his forehead that was bleeding profusely. The third casualty, Petty Officer Jackson, had been hit in the abdomen and was in severe pain. Commander Morrison was coordinating the defensive perimeter while trying to establish communication with the helicopter pilot. When he saw Sarah arrive with Kim, relief flashed across his face for just a moment. "Doc, thank God. We need you to work miracles here." Sarah gently laid Kim down against a rock formation and immediately went to work on Rodriguez. The chest wound was life-threatening, and without immediate intervention, he would drown in his own blood. She unsealed a chest seal from her medical kit and applied it over the wound, while Rodriguez gripped her arm with surprising strength. "Am I going to make it, Doc?" Rodriguez whispered through gritted teeth. Sarah looked into his eyes and saw the fear that every wounded soldier carried. She had seen that look many times before, in other places, during other battles that these men knew nothing about. "You're going to be fine, Rodriguez. Just focus on breathing for me." While monitoring Rodriguez's breathing, she quickly assessed the other casualties. Williams needed stitches, but wasn't in immediate danger. Jackson's abdominal wound was serious but stable if she could control the bleeding. Kim was holding steady with the pressure bandage she had applied earlier. The problem was that she needed to treat all 4 men simultaneously while Taliban forces were closing in on their position. Every few minutes, enemy fire would rake across their defensive perimeter, forcing everyone to take cover. "Morrison, I need more time," Sarah said while starting an IV line in Rodriguez's arm. "These men need surgical intervention, not field medicine. The helicopter is 3 minutes out, but the LZ is still taking fire. We might have to fight our way to an alternate extraction point." Sarah knew what that meant. Moving 4 seriously wounded men over rough terrain while under fire was a recipe for disaster. At least one of them, probably Rodriguez, wouldn't survive the journey. That's when she made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "Morrison, give me 2 men and all the ammunition we can spare. Set up a defensive position here while you take the walking wounded to the alternate LZ." Commander Morrison stared at her in disbelief. "Doc, you can't stay here with the seriously wounded. This position will be overrun in 20 minutes. Rodriguez and Kim can't be moved. If we try to transport them now, they'll die anyway. At least here I can keep them alive until the helicopter can make another pass." What none of the SEALs knew was that Sarah had made similar decisions before, in other conflicts, with other units. She had held defensive positions while treating casualties under impossible circumstances. She had experience that none of them could imagine, but she had never told them about the 2 Purple Hearts in her service record or the Bronze Star with valor that she kept locked in a drawer at home. She had never mentioned the 18 months she spent with a special operations medical unit in Iraq, or the night she held off an entire insurgent squad while keeping 3 wounded Rangers alive. As Taliban gunfire intensified around their position, Sarah Chen prepared to reveal just how much combat experience their quiet medic really possessed. Commander Morrison looked at Sarah with a mixture of admiration and concern. The small medic who had barely spoken during team meetings was volunteering to hold a defensive position against overwhelming odds. Before he could protest further, Taliban fighters appeared on the ridge above them, and the decision was made for everyone. "Torres, Henderson, you stay with Doc," Morrison ordered, as bullets sparked off the rocks around them. "Everyone else, we're moving to the alternate LZ now." Sarah handed Morrison a small digital camera from her medical kit. "If something happens to me, make sure this gets to my sister in California. Everything else is in my footlocker." Morrison took the camera, studying Sarah's face. There was something in her eyes that he had never seen before. Not fear or resignation, but a calm certainty that spoke of experience far beyond her apparent years. "Doc, when this is over, you and I are having a long conversation about your background." Sarah smiled for the first time since the mission began. "Yes, sir." Looking forward to it, the remaining SEALs moved out toward the alternate extraction point, carrying Williams and Jackson between them. Sarah watched them disappear into the darkness, then turned her attention back to Rodriguez and Kim. Both men were stable, but required constant monitoring. Torres and Henderson took up defensive positions on either side of the small rocky outcrop that provided their only cover. The Taliban forces were advancing slowly, using fire and movement tactics to close the distance. Sarah estimated they had maybe 15 minutes before being overrun. "Doc, how many magazines do you have?" Torres called out, while changing positions to get a better angle on the approaching enemy. "6, Sarah replied, checking her ammunition pouches. "But I've also got some other things that might help." She reached into her medical bag and pulled out 4 M67 fragmentation grenades. Torres stared at her in surprise. Standard medic kits didn't include offensive weapons. "Where did you get those?" "Long story. I'll tell you later if we're still alive." Sarah checked Rodriguez's pulse and breathing while listening to the sounds of advancing Taliban fighters. His condition was deteriorating, despite the chest seal and IV fluids. Without surgical intervention soon, he would go into cardiac arrest. Kim was more alert now, and despite his leg wound, he could still operate his weapon. "Doc, give me a rifle. I can still fight." Sarah looked at his pale complexion and the blood-soaked bandage around his thigh. "Kim, you need to stay still and let your body recover. We've got this handled." What she didn't say was that she had already made peace with the possibility that none of them would survive the next hour. The Taliban forces had them outnumbered at least 6-1, and reinforcements were still arriving. The first serious assault came just after 0300 hours. Taliban fighters rushed their position from 2 directions, while laying down suppressive fire from the ridge. Sarah took cover over Rodriguez, while Torres and Henderson returned fire from their defensive positions. Through the muzzle flashes and chaos, Sarah saw 3 Taliban fighters break through Henderson's line of fire and advance directly toward their position. She grabbed her M4 carbine and switched from medic to combat soldier in an instant. Her first shot took down the lead fighter at 30 meters. The second and third rounds dropped his companions before they could return effective fire. Torres looked back at her with amazement. "Jesus, Doc. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah didn't answer. She was too busy checking Rodriguez, who had been hit by a stray bullet during the firefight. The round had passed through his left shoulder, missing vital organs but causing additional blood loss that his body couldn't afford. "Torres, I need you to put direct pressure here while I work on this new wound," she called out while tearing open another medical pack. The second assault came 20 minutes later, and this time, the Taliban fighters had learned from their mistakes. They used covering fire from multiple positions while advancing in small groups. Sarah found herself fighting and providing medical care simultaneously, switching between her rifle and medical supplies every few seconds. During a brief lull in the fighting, Henderson crawled over to where Sarah was working on Rodriguez. "Doc, my radio's been hit. Any word from Morrison about that helicopter?" 10 Pernod. Sarah shook her head while starting another IV line in Rodriguez's right arm. "No communication since they left. We're on our own until dawn." That's when Kim spoke up from his position against the rocks. Despite his leg wound and blood loss, he had been observing Sarah throughout the firefight. "Doc, you've been in combat before, haven't you? I mean real combat. Not just training exercises." Sarah paused in her medical work and looked at the 3 wounded SEALs. They deserved to know who they were fighting alongside. "Iraq, 2018 to 2020. I was attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment as a Special Operations Medic. 18 months of combat deployments in Anbar Province." Torres stopped changing magazines and stared at her. "The Rangers? Doc, why didn't you ever mention this?" "Because it didn't matter until now. I'm here to keep you guys alive, not to impress anyone with war stories." Sarah went back to work on Rodriguez, but Kim wasn't finished with his questions. "What unit were you with in Iraq?" Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion. We ran night raids on high-value targets throughout the Triangle of Death." Henderson let out a low whistle. "Doc, Charlie Company had the highest casualty rate of any Ranger unit during that deployment. Those guys saw some serious action." Charlie. Yes, they did. And I kept as many of them alive as I could." The 3rd Taliban assault began just before dawn, and this time Sarah could see that the enemy had brought reinforcements. At least 40 fighters were moving toward their position from multiple directions. The SEAL team was critically low on ammunition, and Rodriguez was barely clinging to life. Sarah made a decision that would become legendary among Special Operations Forces. She pulled out her last 2 grenades, popped the pins, and held them with the spoons in place. "Torres, Henderson, when I give the word, you run toward the alternate LZ with Kim and Rodriguez. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just run." "Doc, what are you doing?" Torres asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Buying you time. Rodriguez won't survive another firefight, and Kim can't move fast enough on that leg. This is the only way." Henderson started to protest, but Sarah cut him off. "That's an order. You have 2 minutes to get them ready for transport." The Taliban fighters were now within grenade range of their position. Sarah could hear them calling out to each other as they coordinated their final assault. In the growing daylight, she could see at least 20 men moving directly toward them. "Go. Now." Torres and Henderson lifted Rodriguez between them, while Kim used his rifle as a crutch. They started moving toward the extraction point, as fast as the wounded men could travel. Sarah waited until they were 100 meters away, then stood up from behind the rocks. The Taliban fighters saw her immediately and opened fire. Sarah threw the first grenade into the largest group of attackers, then the second, into a squad trying to flank their former position. The explosions bought her team precious seconds to escape, but instead of running after them, Sarah did something that surprised even her. She picked up her medical bag, grabbed a dropped enemy rifle, and began a fighting withdrawal toward the extraction point. Every few meters, she would stop, engage the pursuing Taliban fighters, then continue moving. What the enemy didn't know was that Sarah Chen had performed similar actions twice before in Iraq. She had earned her Bronze Star by holding off an insurgent attack while evacuating wounded Rangers. She had received her second Purple Heart during a mission very similar to this one. The helicopter found her 40 minutes later, still fighting and still carrying her medical bag. Torres, Henderson, Kim, and Rodriguez were all alive and receiving medical attention when the aircraft landed to pick her up. As Sarah climbed aboard the helicopter, Commander Morrison grabbed her arm and had to shout over the noise of the rotors. "Doc, when we get back to base, you and I are definitely having that conversation." Sarah nodded while checking Rodriguez's vital signs one more time. All 4 wounded SEALs would survive to fight another day. For her, That was the only mission objective that truly mattered. Later that evening, back at the forward operating base, Commander Morrison found Sarah sitting alone outside the medical tent. She was finally getting treatment for her own wounds. Shrapnel cuts on her arm and shoulder that she had ignored during the entire mission. "Doc, I did some checking on your service record," Morrison said, sitting down beside her. 2 Purple Hearts, Bronze Star with Valor, Combat Medical Badge, and a unit citation for extraordinary heroism. Why didn't you tell us? Sarah looked out at the desert landscape, remembering other battles in other places with other soldiers who had depended on her skills and courage. "Because it's not about the medals, Commander. It's about bringing everyone home alive. That's what medics do." From that day forward, every SEAL in Team 7 understood that their quiet medic was much more than she appeared to be. Sarah Chen had proven that heroism often wore the smallest packages and spoke with the quietest voices. Word of the mission spread throughout the special operations community. The story of the medic who held off an entire Taliban assault while saving 4 wounded SEALs became part of military legend. But for Sarah, it was just another day at work, keeping her teammates alive no matter what the cost. When she was awarded her 3rd Purple Heart and 2nd Bronze Star for the Afghanistan mission, Sarah Chen stood at attention while the medals were pinned to her uniform. In the audience, 12 Navy SEALs watched in complete silence, finally understanding the true measure of the woman who had earned their respect through actions rather than words. The wounded had been saved. The quiet had been broken. And every SEAL present would never again underestimate the combat medic who had shown them what real courage looked like under fire.